I'm recording and I've got video up.
Cookie, are you recording? Cookie! Cookie!
Oh, we've lost him.
That's a shame. It's July 29th, 2018, episode 77 of Fancy Ramen. I'm Neil.
And I'm Scott.
And this is the episode without Cookie. He is in Kansas. He's doing Scott things, I think he told us, meaning he's probably outdoors, probably getting lost, and probably having to find food in the wilderness of some sort.
That sounds about right. Normally I pack some food in with me. Like, that's the only thing that's slightly different is, I don't resort to like eating bark off of trees within the first couple hours.
But sometimes you're confused because you're eating Cliff Bars and they kind of taste like bark off of a tree.
Yeah. You're not a fan of the Cliff Bar?
No, actually, I like most of the flavors. I've had a few that are kind of rough.
They have some weird stuff.
The flavor or the bar that I have not found one I've liked at all is the Lar bar.
Oh, Lara bars, I know what you're talking about. Those are they're like entirely fruit protein or whatever. They're vegan bars. I've had a couple of them because Sierra has brought them around. I like those too.
I'm not fond of the way I feel like my teeth are always going to collapse in on themselves when I eat them. Like, the taste is actually pretty fine. But maybe if it would dissolve better, I would just suck on them as opposed to chew on them. But they have a unique flavor set because I think I had like an apple pie one that tasted pretty solid. But again, I felt like I was worried about pulling the teeth straight from my socket as I chewed on them.
Have you ever? I used to like let Jolly Ranchers sit on my teeth and kind of dissolve, and then pull them apart. But then I worried that like I was just gonna pull a tooth out of its socket one of these days when I was a kid. It's a bad feeling.
No good. This apparently is now the podcast where dentists will listen
Cringe.
only for pain. Only for pain.
Trying
What
to
have you
figure
been
out
up to
my
this past
ideal
week?
mic setup.
Trying out new angles.
Yeah, we'll see how this works. I kind of like it. Let's see. Yesterday, I played a little bit of tennis and enjoyed a large like farmers market festival in a smaller town called Hamilton, where I have some family at. And so I got to actually see quite a bit of family on my dad's mom's side or my paternal grandma's side. So like mini family reunion. That was cool. I've gone to, did I bring it up last week? I went and saw the new like Lakeith Stanfield Tessa Thompson movie, Sorry to Bother You, which was pretty wild. A very interesting movie. I don't know if I want to talk about it though, but I thought it was an entertaining indie film for sure.
Are those like famous actor/actresses?
So
that
Lakeith
you named off?
Stanfield is like, he's kind of like an up and coming actor from what I can tell. He's one of the characters in the show Atlanta. And then Tessa Thompson has been on a couple big screen movies. She's in the Marvel universe. She plays, what is it? She plays Valkyrie, I think. So I saw her for the first time in Thor Ragnarok, but I've seen her on the television in other roles too.
So is this kind of like the equivalent of what 500 Days of Summer was like? Because neither Zooey Deschanel or Joseph Gordon-Levitt were necessarily like A-list names when that came out.
I would guess so. I feel like 500 Days of Summer, though, was probably, I don't know, this has a super indie and just weird erratic vibe to its construction and presentation. Like, there is a portion of it in which they have like a claymation like commercial that appears in the middle of the movie, and it's just this weird, like, there's just a lot of weird, like, I don't know if it's particularly meant to just be jarring to add to the what's the word, like, it's a surrealist kind of film, so I don't know if it's meant to be jarring and surrealist as part of the theme of the film, or if it's just like trying another weird genre to kind of like mesh it in with everything else. It's weird. I have a really hard time describing it because it's kind of all over the place, but the basic premise is like Lakeith Stanfield's character gets hired at a call center and goes from being like a lowly employee to a power caller, which instead of selling like, who knows, encyclopedias over the phone, he's like making huge business deals for like large multinational or global organizations. And it's like his moral struggle to earn his money and get his at the acknowledgement that it's coming at a like large cost to others in society. It's a very it's definitely got some like socially progressive or literally like socialist vibes to it as far as films go. But it's also incredibly funny. Like, there's a lot of great humor in it. In one of the office scenes in the very beginning of the movie, there you can see in the background like some people are dealing with a printer error, and there are just like sheets flying in the background in this office, like just paper being cascaded up, like when you see those old game shows with the money wind tunnels. And it just gets like progressively worse and more intense as the shot progresses. Like every time it cuts back, there's just more paper, and people are just like gathering around watching it just start to flood the room with shooting papers everywhere, and lights are flickering. So it's really entertaining.
When you were talking about the claymation portion of it, is that actually set within universe? So it's like someone flips on a TV and there it is, or does it actually? Yeah. Okay, it's not like immersion.
The movie doesn't change to claymation, which would be even crazier. But it does go from being a relatively, like, it goes from being a relatively like believable plot to just this dissension into like near madness for the viewer and the people involved. Like, from a standard film perspective, in which you could say like this is a realistic fiction, to this is starting to progress into like almost a sci-fi horror element that integrates itself to the film later. And it's like, I don't want to spoil anything for it, but it just does this like evolution into different film genre by the end of it. Yeah, that's probably the best I can describe it. I feel like I'm very under-equipped to actually talk about this film in full detail.
What did those 4 years in film critic school go towards, huh?
I have spent zero minutes, 0 hours in any sort of like education towards film critique. So really, I'm maybe the worst person to get movie advice from.
It wasn't like one of those easy credits you could do. That's what I did at UNL.
I did some music appreciation stuff.
Yeah, I did that too. That was a waste of time.
That's pretty easy for anybody who's listened to music regularly. So that worked out for me. Film appreciation and like film critique, I listened to one podcast that I listen to 2 podcasts that do that, and I feel like I've gotten most of my understanding of film from just listening to those. But it's like, it's passive education, and both of them are more meant for entertainment than for actual education. So
right.
It's like few and far between where I actually get a nugget of really valuable takeaways. But yeah, that's been my week for the most part. Have you been just slogging it out at work still?
Well, yeah, although I think that time's basically come to an end. I had the chance to actually get off at reasonable times towards the end of this week. Though I spent most of that messing around with the new sous vide and also getting both computers operating in like a somewhat functional workflow at the same time. And I mean, first to tackle the less interesting topic, which is the computers, I would probably say it's nice now being able to render out like episodes at a time of whatever let's play or LP, while still being able to use the other PC, be it just for anything, because you don't necessarily want to do things like play games or do any sort of extreme taxing browsing, like streaming videos or anything like that. On the same computer that you're rendering on, especially if it's CPU-based rendering. But I don't know. It never occurred to me that the question of how to get a keyboard and mouse to work on two computers would have to be so complex. And it seems like it'd be fine if you just had the most bland and boring keyboard and mouse, especially with the old school inputs, because they have KVM switches that will just route those old connectors. They're kind of like serial connectors in the regards that there's multiple ports, but it's condensed down to like a barrel style connection actually, instead of USB. But the USB KVM switches I've been looking at all seem to have like a very differing experiences across the board. Some people saying that like if you have anything that has any sort of firmware or connects to an app at all, it starts to become an issue if you have like a multiple button mouse, aside from like your scroll wheel and your left and right.
Right.
Things get complex.
Essentially mouse for and forward.
Yeah. So right now I just literally have two mice, a trackball and my regular mouse, and two keyboards stationed in front of me so I can use either computer at once, and then just trying to figure out the best way to arrange my two monitors in a way that I can switch between the two computers. But boring talk aside, the sous vide just did some chicken breasts. They're pretty good. I cooked them for like 2 hours at 140. I already think chicken is probably the plainest meat in the world, so like the texture was surprisingly good, even though it was very cheap chicken as well. So I'm looking forward to actually putting some real meat in it.
I assume you're gonna do like a steak sometime soon in the sous vide.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to like experience exactly how it works first on some other lesser expensive meats, so I also picked up some pork riblets. I don't know how long those have to cook though, so if it's like 6-7 hours, that might be tomorrow or something else. Excuse me. But that was pretty fun, and I would say it's surprising how well it turned out, given that I like opened up the box for the sous vide and realized that there were no instructions and just like a step-by-step way to like set it up, and then another set of instructions to hook it up to your phone and download the app. And I'm like, I'm not fucking using the app. Maybe that is going to tell me how not to shock myself, but I think I can just figure this out on my own. And it turned out okay. But we'll see. I'm really, really curious about, like, it's going to be hard for me to buy that first few steaks because steak is expensive, and like you need a thick cut, otherwise there's no point to using the sous vide. Like if I'm gonna get like an 8-ounce New York strip, like if I try and sear that afterwards, it's gonna end up cooking it well anyways. I bought a cast iron, which I've had one in the past, a real small one, and that thing like it did its job for like a one-man cooking device in college, but I don't think I necessarily did the best to actually keep up with its maintenance. So I wanted to ask you, Scott, since you are the master of seasoning cast iron, I have a pre-seasoned cast iron, and I didn't necessarily want to go through the trouble of seasoning it over. Like I read that you could use salts to wear it down and then re-season it. But if I don't want to season it again for the time being, is there something I can do? Like, what's the best practice to utilize it as it is right now?
So you've used it quite a bit, and you just feel like it's kind of lacking lacking some of that seasoning?
Oh no, I haven't used it yet. So
You haven't used it at all.
But I bought a pre-seasoned.
It's pre-seasoned.
Yeah.
Okay. You can pretty much, I mean, if it's pre-seasoned, you can pretty much roll with it. I'd start cooking foods right away that you kind of want to get a transfer of flavor from.
Okay.
So like a great thing to start out with, for instance, since you're in an omnivorous household, like fry up some bacon in that, and then, obviously don't let the bacon fat solidify around it, but leave enough behind that the iron kind of soaks it up a little bit. And then, the next time you make pancakes, you may actually get some of that, say, maybe smokier or like umami flavor kind of baked into the pancake. It may take a couple of times with that. So like I think I use my cast iron skillet very frequently for like frying eggs. And so I normally have, depending on what I'm feeling, like butter or olive oil. And that also depends on like what fat I have to cook with. I use those for my fried eggs. And then I essentially let the pan cool down, get any of the remaining like oil or whatnot poured out of it, and then give the pan like afterward just a quick wipe over with a paper towel, and make sure that it has like oil of some sort or some fat, like essentially just coating all of the metal that you'll cook with to the point where it has just a little bit of a sheen or a gloss to it. And that'll, as it dries and kind of evaporates, just kind of get into the cookware. You can also cook it in by putting it in the oven and just kind of like baking some of that in. With it being pre-seasoned, it should work just fine.
So when I'm done cooking something, we'll say searing some riblets tonight, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Do I end up like I obviously don't scrub it, but do I use any soap at all to give it like a wash down?
Never,
no?
Never, ever use soap. It'll soak up the soap, and you will taste soap for the rest of the life of that cast iron. You can't use soap. It's actually one of those items that you really don't want to bother with like cleaning too much. So when you want to get things that have stuck to your pan out, just pour in water and boil it, and use that boiling water with like a scraper, and normally do something like a plastic scraper, or if you're feeling, confident enough, use just like a washcloth or something and kind of like scrape at the bits or the detritus that you don't want in the pan, that is just essentially food waste that's sitting there. Get it out of the pan, let the water dry, and then once again give it an oil or a fat treatment of some sort, just with a paper towel, so it'll soak it back up. And that'll do it. Like, you won't have to worry about re-seasoning it unless you really mess it up somehow, or like scour off the seasoning with steel wool.
Interesting.
Also, don't cook too many acidic foods with it in a row.
Yeah, I did hear that.
Yeah, so avoid, like, if you're going to be using tomatoes in something, like, avoid doing something with tomatoes a couple times in the cast iron skillet, because that acid will just kind of eat through the seasoning that you have. And it's not good for the iron either.
I'm thinking this pan will mostly just be used for searing meats at this point, but once it gets seasoned in a little stronger and starts to retain more of that nonstick like property.
Yeah, and
I
just
guess
make sure you're use an ample amount of fat when you start. Like, it's a good idea to just kind of overcompensate with a little bit more fat than you usually would. Yeah. And it'll be pretty non-stick in that way, and because of its absorption qualities, it will. I wonder if it's actually more like adsorption. That's probably a tangent for another time. But
you mean where like the pan itself is not actually just absorbing the oils, but it's actually growing a layer of.
Yeah, because adsorption means that like things are being attached to the surface, while absorption means it's actually being like retained on the interior of whatever the object is.
So what would it be though if, like, because I know cast iron or iron in general is like a porous material. So is it adsorption?
So it probably
or
is
absorption?
absorption. Yeah, it probably is. AB versus AD. So I'm thinking AB, absorption, but maybe I don't know for sure.
It's
Since it's
absorption
also
on the
a
macro
layer,
level, adsorption on the micro. I don't know if that's actually true or not.
I think maybe the reverse there.
But wouldn't it so if it's a porous object, the oils are going into the pores of the iron and solidifying there.
Which would be that would be a micro scale action, right? But in macro scale,
Maybe?
when we're looking at it, the oils and fats are like readily available on the outside because of
Yeah,
their
which is a
permeation
macro.
through it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes
Welcome
sense.
to Fancy Ramen, the actual cooking podcast. It's taken me almost 70 episodes to turn it around and into the direction, but we're getting there.
Oh, one of my
I just
friends.
had to abandon Cookie in the Woods.
One of my friends actually brought up. They were listening to the podcast and they said that tonkatsu ramen is not a thing unless you like to put your pork, your pork chop. He said it's something different. I can't think of what he calls it though. Cutlet, your pork cutlet, and submerge it into your ramen, and that it's actually tonkotsu.
Okay, I thought that tonkatsu was the fried pork cutlet itself.
Yep, it is.
And so the tonkatsu ramen was just ramen that was indicating that it had the fried pork cutlet in it. There's so much complexity to ramen that we actually don't know that makes us a bad ramen advice podcast for now.
Instead,
we'll get there.
tonkotsu, KO, is the fried pork ramen essentially, but not like batter pork cutlet or breaded pork cutlet, I guess.
Okay, it's the pork belly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So there you go, Dan. That one's for you.
Yeah.
I was going to just point out, though, that aside from all of that nonsense, I also was thinking about changing podcast hosts, or we'll say tools for our RSS feed, because I fucking hate what we're using right now, which is like Simply Podcasting from WordPress, or it's a WordPress app. So there's a chance that if you're listening to this episode, or actually, I'll just say rather, there's a chance if you're one of our RSS feed listeners of subscribers, aka you've listened to the audio, you might see the episode list change drastically in due time. Hopefully nothing will change in terms of the feed URL, so you won't have to change anything, but if we suddenly have one episode again and that happens to be 78 or 79 or whatever, don't be alarmed. That's probably just because I ended up switching utilities. So, video games. What have you been playing this week?
I played a touch of Octopath Traveler. I think since we spoke last, I've completed some of the second chapter tasks, and I am starting to appreciate the storylines a little bit more. They are really progressing down different paths in tone, which is really nice. Like, we can say that they already were different in tone from the start of some of them. Like, I don't think anyone can say that Tressa's path is particularly dark or
sinister.
She's like, I'm going to follow this journal and be a great merchant. And I'm like, I'm so glad I selected the most whimsical and just non-serious plot as the main one that I have, because her second storyline remains relatively whimsical. She's like, oh, these capitalist practices are bad. And now I have a merchant rival. And so she's coming to just very obvious conclusions that a naive merchant probably would. Meanwhile, progressing down, say, Primrose's path, or who else did I go through? Cyrus's path. Cyrus's path gets dark really quickly. His takes quite the turn as he encounters... Well, I don't know if it qualifies as necromancy or blood magic at this point, but he's starting to get into the darker parts of the mystical arts, and it's pretty cool. He has an interesting path, and Primrose's storyline of revenge is progressing down what you would expect, taking unorthodox means to execute her goals, and in the case literally execute characters who have wronged her and her family. I just really like how the stories in this game are really branching out. It does seem to me as though they actually took a bit of care and intention on making like 8 relatively interesting and completely different stories from one another, which I didn't know if it was going to be a gimmick as we proceeded further into the game where the stories actually all come together. Like, I had some suspicion that it could work that way. There's still opportunity for everything to kind of come together in an overarching plot, though it seems less likely as I progress forward in the game. The mechanics are still great. Like, I'm starting to get to the point where, instead of encountering Lizard Man 1, 2, and 3, I am now encountering Lizard Man 4, 5, 6. And they have some familiar weaknesses and other different weaknesses, but they also have skill sets and abilities that are making the battles more challenging in a way that is not just relying on giving them like higher health and higher damage as the only differences. They're starting to have a multitude of different attacks, and like elemental resistances are becoming more relevant for my characters. I wasn't very worried about that with the first round of story quests, and now that I'm progressing outward, I feel like I need to build my party and think more and more tactically as I progress forward if I'm not, in some cases, over-leveled. Because Tressa, my main character, is now hitting like into the 30s with her levels, and most of these recommended levels for the second paths are in the 20s. So she's obscenely powerful against some enemies, but if I still don't have the abilities to break enemies, she's less useful than you would expect a unit that has like 10 levels up on the enemies that it's fighting, which is also nice. It's another way to force your hand into experimenting with your party types without like the game directly making you change party through some other mechanic. Like, you are being incentivized to do so as opposed to just grind through it. And you're also not being forced to switch because of some storyline element or you're being allowed to make the decision of your own accord, even if it is kind of a necessity to progress through the game.
I've gone through a couple of the Chapter 2 quests, and I've also witnessed some of the story from Tiff Plain in later quests too. And I can say there's actually some, I'll maybe put it this way, there are some connections between stories that you don't necessarily even realize until after the fact, which is actually really cool. When stories become more complex, the more you think about them, I appreciate that. And I think that's a sign of good writing. Assuming like the story up front is still enjoyable enough, the deeper you get into it, the better it gets, I guess, or the more complex it is. I think I'm like starting to develop, despite having the interactions between characters become more abundant. I do kind of wish that the game had taken maybe a different approach with the 8 protagonists, and this is definitely a critique or criticism on the game's fundamental as a whole, but I kind of wish that instead of having all of these 8 characters together at the same time, because when some of the crossover or instances where characters meet characters and so forth, there's really no acknowledgement, even if you have a character from one person's past in your party when you encounter that character. Like, I think this maybe goes... This is probably not a spoiler. Leon, the captain that you meet with Tressa's first chapter, you will run into him again later. And despite having Tressa in the party, Tressa pays no mind or attention to him. And it's like, hey, this is like a dude that basically helped inspire your desire to travel and become an explorer.
Yeah, this is like her hero. It would be very weird for her to just completely ignore his presence in any way.
She kind of does. And that, It's kind of a bummer. Part of me wishes that, like, had they just made the game 8 separate protagonists and separate stories with their own companions, yes, that's a shit ton of more content, and likely they probably would have had worse characters as a result, or at least worse side characters. It would have made the story that they're presently telling across these 8 different characters' paths feel better, because despite some of that banter, it doesn't really feel like there's always a whole lot of connection between those characters with them. And likewise, there are weird things that you end up committing or doing. Like, I won't go into details here, but like, I don't understand why each character would feel motivated to join in another character's quest, even if it goes against their sole principles. Like, for Primrose, she's obviously on this quest, as you know from her intro and from the demo. She wants to, seek revenge for her father's murder. You have a lot of characters that, like, I don't think inherently want to kill anyone ever.
Yeah,
And
Alphen, for instance, is trying to help and heal, and why is he using his axe to condemn a guy who did something wrong to Primrose how many decades ago? Yeah.
And I have some issues with that, and partly the fact that Romancing Saga and Saga Frontier, which I think a lot of people would agree with me, this game gets a lot of its inspiration for its storytelling from. Those games definitely rely on the different narrative point of views to force the player, or at least the stories, to go in very, very different directions. Like, you might play as a warmonger in one part, and then you play as like a young, adventurous little girl in another part, and their stories are very radically different, like we see here, but we don't have the murderous warmonger helping the little girl find flowers for someone or some bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's Tress's storyline or not. I haven't seen any of her other chapters yet.
Okay, yeah. But you make a great point, especially with, like, Primrose. This is such an easy one to pick on, but there is banter right after Primrose has a flashback about her, like, family motto, and Ulbrich is like, it's good to follow a family motto, honorable and respectable, and it's like, yeah, that's totally right, dude. Let's go murder this guy, Stay true to the motto.
So you haven't done his chapter 3 yet, right?
I haven't even done his chapter 2.
Which
he's
I should tell
chasing
you.
down the Black Knight in the Colosseum or whatever.
Yeah, his chapter 2 is pretty cool.
I love Colosseums in RPGs in general. I love Colosseums from how they were implemented in Fire Emblem to the sort of WrestleMania Colosseum in Super Mario or Paper Mario Thousand Year Door. Like, I think a Colosseum storyline is so good for whatever reason. I am hooked by those.
Did you get to the Colosseum in Final Fantasy 6/3?
I still haven't, I still haven't progressed past the point of getting that guy who can suplex things.
Oh my god.
I know.
It's fine,
I have the Super Nintendo hooked up, but I'm just like, now that I have a setup in which I can play my PlayStation a lot more regularly, and it's pretty comfortable playing my Switch, like, I've been catching up on the modern games a lot.
Yeah,
I also have a couple Steam games I bought that I haven't gotten into. I bought Hacknet on your recommendation, and I haven't played it yet, but I'm really excited, and I'm wondering if I try and get my dad to play, because he's been coding with Unix for like 30 years or something, so I think he would find it very interesting to play.
I wonder if he would just be like, this is fucking child's play.
This is a joke. Well, then he can speedrun it.
Yeah, basically. Aside from those criticisms, though, like, the more and more I play this game, the more I realize just how fucking great the soundtrack and the presentation are. So I have gone and seen, like, most of the areas, and I'm assuming the forest areas that you and Cookie were both having issues with. I don't know. I guess I can't sympathize or empathize with the issues you guys are having. Like, I don't know if it was just because I had the forewarning, but I wasn't ever really bothered by, like, having the trees in the foregrounds that became transparent as you walked through them and such.
On the handheld, I think it can be relatively annoying. Um, on the big screen, I have a lot less issues with it, but I think just because Cookie kind of levied that complaint, I did notice it and kind of latch onto it. Um, it is the only example of like graphical difficulty I've had with the game thus far, though. I love the winding construction of these paths. Like, this is a game in which you can really only move in the four cardinal directions, right? Or technically eight if you want to talk about going, say, northwest, northeast, or whatnot on the screen. And yet, their maps feel like really well layered because of the depth perspective and the fact that paths can sometimes be blocked by something that's just in your line of sight. And so you have to keep it eye to detail if there's a pathway that seems to go right through where it looks like there's a rock wall, only to find out that there's actually a tunnel there or something of that nature. Like, I really like the map layout, and for the most part, the density of objects on the screen are a benefit and not a detriment. The forest is the only place where I have like minor complaints, and I do want to acknowledge that they're pretty small.
So I had one little breakthrough once you get through the second or the first layer of quests and you get into some of the new environments and dungeons too. My biggest complaint about dungeon and path design was that everything was just maze paths and it got kind of stale. But as soon as you get into that second level or layer of areas, you start to encounter more wide open fields, whether they're like grasslands, deserts, snow. And then you I remember going through Primrose's second chapter, that short dungeon she has to go through has paths that dissect and then intersect back together, which is like believable. You know, you don't have a fucking cave or a castle that's designed in a way that like there's only one path.
Walkway. Yeah.
Like OSHA goes in there and is like, where's the fire escapes, guys?
I know. I know exactly what you're talking about because I noticed it too when there is essentially you're moving to the right hand side in this small cave and you have like a small staircase etched into the stone for an upper path, or there's a lower path. And I don't even think you miss really access to many treasures because the branching paths also happen after you've taken the upper or the lower paths or before it. And so it's just like you're taking the high road or the low road, but it does not matter on how you get there, and you don't feel like you've missed out and you really have to backtrack down the other path. I still did because of that paranoia that I will miss something, but I noted that and enjoyed that there are more open and branching paths that let you just kind of explore a different perspective of the area without missing out on any extra items or loot.
Yeah. The music too, like I noticed they switched the battle theme once you get into that second area. It's not as good as the first theme, but it's still it's still good. Like those two facts alone.
The third area might be the best. Like that's the exciting thing.
I'm assuming there might even be a fourth area if there's chapter 4s too, but who knows? We can actually talk about the gameplay because that's our main topic, which is JRPG or turn-based RPG mechanics and essentially how they've evolved and what they can, like what has kept them fresh. Because honestly, this is a genre that like once was maybe it's not right to say this, but it basically seemed like the biggest genre, like in the mid 90s, late 90s. We had like Final Fantasy VII. That was definitely a huge, or not the game itself, but just that era was a huge high point in your turn-based RPGs or Japanese RPGs. And you could argue a bit before that too.
I think it was a huge genre during the Super Nintendo, and then I feel like a little bit of it came back on the JRPG end with the GameCube as well. If we're talking just Nintendo, GameCube same time as PlayStation 2 and whatnot, there's quite a few big name titles that came out again with turn-based RPGs, but they really, I was introduced to them during the Super Nintendo era, and then they really dominated a large amount of play that I did during the GameCube and like PS2 generation as well. So I think it's fair to say that they've been a solidified genre since like the Super Nintendo era.
And they definitely, I mean, they it's hard to speak about like the Nintendo era because, I was single digits at that point in time.
Me too.
But like Dragon
well,
Quest
I don't even think
and
I was
Final
born
Fantasy
when the NES
originated
came out.
from there too. But like obviously as we've gone further and further into present day or into the future, like the identity of the RPG definitely seems to be on shaky grounds, especially when you look at like Final Fantasy 15 is far less turn-based and really I guess not turn-based at all at this case.
Yeah, it's RPG action at that point. I think we're watching titles that we thought would be kind of concretely in that turn-based RPG format, like really breaking from it. And I like it. I applaud it. I think that there are games that definitely benefit from it. The Final Fantasy game that I played the most of when I was younger was, I was telling you, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which was a real-time game. All of your actions essentially took place in tandem with any sort of enemy movement or actions, and it was an open space and not, a contained like battle screen with menus and turns and grid-based combat or things like that. But I do like that the turn-based systems we've kind of watched grow and develop down different paths as well on how we encounter turn-based games, because I think turn-based games can still be fun. We've seen 6 generations of Pokemon, 7 now. I don't know where we're at anymore with the Pokemon generations. We're very deep into them, and they've been turn-based games at their core for the battle mechanic since the very beginning, back in the 90s. And so I think there is something to be said that like turn-based games can feel stale, but ultimately with like some refreshments and tweaks can feel still very new and fun and fresh. So I've made kind of a list of games of note that I just thought like really changed up a format that made things more interesting to the to our genre of turn-based combat. And the first one that I actually put on there is one that I don't have very much experience with that we just admitted maybe 10 minutes ago, which is Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 6 for American audiences. And I feel like reading about that game, there are a lot of different things that were implemented that seem to make it very memorable and enjoyable for players like you who have played the whole game. From what I understand, they introduced the job system in that game.
So they introduced that into 5? No, actually, my bad. Final Fantasy 3, actual 3 in Japan, they introduced the job system. So that was for the Nintendo, actually.
Oh, okay. So I may have misread that then. But the other thing I did note for that, and I don't know if it's true for the other Final Fantasy games, is that Final Fantasy 6 had the interesting use of like different inputs for characters. I think they were kind of the inspiration that you see for what is one of my favorite like RPGs, the Super Mario RPGs. Like the Paper Mario franchise are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but games in which selecting an action in a menu is not the last input you'll make before you have the transaction of dealing damage or defending and negating some damage or doing an action on the screen. Like you have to put in a directional input on your controller to swing Mario's hammer and release at the right point in time. And when you get to more advanced level play, you can then hit, say, the A button in Paper Mario 1,000 Year Door to do a backflip. And then if you hit it perfectly again another time, you do another backflip. And this nets you points for being more stylish and like precise in your executions of commands. But in like Final Fantasy VI for American audiences, I don't remember the name of our suplex guy, but like to do his attacks, you're putting in directional inputs after you've selected doing his like combat, correct?
Yep. Sabin, and for that matter, every character has like a slightly different mechanic to them, and some of which don't have necessarily any key inputs, but they're so diverse in a way that like they are basically like your classes like you had from the original Final Fantasy. But the bigger difference, I guess you could say, is that some of these characters had completely different. They're no longer just menu driven mechanics like Sabin, as you brought up. Is it Cyan or Cayenne? I can't remember how his name's actually pronounced, but he's the samurai, and his mechanic is based off of a meter. So when you select his sword art or whatever it's called, I think it might actually be Bushido. A meter pops up on the screen, and it starts off at 0 or 1 rather. And if you stop it at 1, then he does a specific skill. And as you get him stronger and stronger, he unlocks different levels of that. So from 1 to 2 to 3. And if the meter goes up far enough, you can use those different skills. But the idea is that since this is a quote-unquote active battle system, I think is what ABS stands for Final Fantasy, the more time you waste there, the more time enemies have to cast spells, attack you, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to think of just the people that had like the unique mechanics built to them, because you had like Locke could steal things and Shadow can throw things, but those are still just menu driven.
And like the guy who has the auto crossbow, you just like that's a select attack all with a physical attack.
Maybe like the cool thing, one of the cooler things that came up, because again, like most of these characters just have recycled skill sets or attributes from older games, but you had, I think it's Go-Go or Golgo, I can't remember for sure, but their ability was to just mime or mimic. So if you had a character do something, then they would mimic the exact same thing they would do. So if you have someone with like an amazing spell or whatever, or you have like multiple casts of that amazing spell, Go-Go would mimic that exact action or actions. And that's definitely, I don't think a game did anything like that, or an RPG, a turn-based RPG did anything like that up until that point. But it's also interesting because like Mario did such a good job of keeping like an active, like forcing you to be actively like present in your battles because of those timed buttons. And then a couple games later, Final Fantasy 8 did the same thing by introducing the gun blade with Squall, where you had to hit the right trigger, I think it was R1, at just the perfect time, and that would essentially simulate the act of Squall pulling the trigger on his gun blade as he's cutting through the enemy to deal bonus damage. And then, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the not so great thing they did is when you would do your summons in that game, which I think they were called Guardians or something, you would have to button mash to get them to deal more damage, which that sucked, but
Does anybody like button mashing? I feel like there are people who are proud of how well they can button mash, but I feel like I hate the mechanic a lot. I can see how it's fun in a like QTE in which you're button mashing, because Vanquish is a good game with that, or like Asura's Wrath, in which your character is literally like speeding up on their punches or their attacks on an enemy, and so you're just button mashing and you're watching their momentum increase as they're doing more damage. I'm sure God of War has something similar to that too. Like God of War does a really good job with the like tactile feeling of QTEs. But when it's just button mashing to button mash, I feel like it is the most annoying thing in the entire world. But I'm also a slow masher.
I would agree with you. I mean, I would even go as far as to say, like, I think button mashing as a whole is
lazy,
just bad. And the only time it's better is if it's in a QTE. So like, I play a lot of games that have QTEs, and I kind of hate QTEs at the same time, because I think QTEs are like a poor way to, like, they're a poor way to illustrate your action
agency
or
as a
inaction
player
within a game. And so part of this goes into the whole idea of games being accessible for people to play. It's like, yes, someone with disabilities will not necessarily be able to play twitch shooters or first-person shooters at the same level as someone who is perfectly capable, like physically capable. And so one of the reasons why I've always liked turn-based RPGs too is that it's the concept that like I don't have to be anyone can enjoy these games. If you have the presence of mind, you can play an RPG because most of the battle systems are simple, or the control functions are simple enough in a way that, you know, I could play it with one hand. And the games that rely on QTEs, I think, kind of prohibit like maybe it's a small number of people, but still a small like a group of people that don't necessarily have the reaction speed or the know-it-all with the controller to make those things happen. So in those cases, having like button mashing usually gives you more time to react, which I can appreciate, but at the same time it's still like it's become the lesser of two evils in that case. But I don't think there's like a good way to replace QTEs in those narrative type of games, because if you completely remove it, then you're basically just playing a visual novel. And I think the immersion there is even less. Like there's an inherent problem there.
Yeah.
But back onto the topic of RPGs. The next game I wanted to actually bring up was Child of Light. That was the next one on your list, and for the record, I want to note that I've played a demo of Child of Light, so you'll have to probably go a little more in depth than what I'm capable of.
That's fine. I've got 20-something hours on Child of Light, which is a much longer game than I ever anticipated while playing it. But basically, you're familiar enough with the battle system through the demo that the only thing that you're missing out on is as more characters get introduced, they have more impacts on they have a larger diversity of attacks and effects that affect the battle system, which is essentially a timeline in which you have a meter, and for a large majority of the meter, your character's speed is determining how far they progress down it. And then they get to a stop point in which they're essentially charging an action up. And said action could be something that executes very quickly. And so I'm sure the internal math and the programming is that it gets a like ×2 or ×3 advantage to its progression through the meter, right? It multiplies against your speed. Otherwise, or it's a selection, like if you both select a normal speed and you both get at the meter at the same time, maybe it's a uniform speed that any character icon works through. That sounds a little less likely to me. But your character initiates an action, and if they're interrupted or an enemy character is interrupted in the middle of this second smaller bar before the end of it in which you execute, they are, in Child of Light, knocked backwards, essentially stunned back to the beginning of the first like ready bar. Essentially, you go from the ready bar to the charging in action, and so really talented players, I think, are able to juggle the actions that they take, especially when the completed action has an impact by stopping an enemy on their turn through a stun, so they're stuck somewhere on the timeline, or just executing an attack quick enough to knock someone off of the charging stage back to the bottom of the ready stage, or double the speed of someone on their progression through the bars, or have the speed of someone on their progression through the bars. Like, there are all these different effects on the timeline of getting to take attacks that are a lot more active than just previous turn-based games in which the speed of a character essentially determines where they're at on the turn order. And to add to that, in the single-player mode, the single player gets to control what is otherwise in the two-player mode a secondary character called Ignis that can either expend freely acquired energy to minorly heal allies or slow down enemies during any of their actions, whether it's their charging turn or it's their readying turn on the meter. And it just allows for like a very large amount of complexity on the play of timing in a game that already has all of the other elements of basic disparities in stats between types of units, whether it's like defense or elemental defense, elemental attack, critical hit rates, things like that. And I really like that. And I saw that it was inspired by a game called Grandia that I have no background on, so I didn't want to talk about it, but just bring it up if people have some familiarity with that over the Child of Light game. But from the demo, I think you get to experience all of that. But it's another example in how all of these mechanics that I like to see in these turn-based games are essentially doing the thing that I think we spoke about many podcasts back, where it is building a game type that is accessible for anyone, new players, but has extreme amounts of depth to very skilled players. It's the whole Super Smash Bros. You can button mash and be, 6 or 7 years old and have an amazing time, but you can also play Melee and learn wave dashing mechanics and essentially play at a skill level that is unrecognizable to like beginning players, but both people can have fun in their respective competitions or engagement with the game.
In the middle of that explanation too, I did have that "oh yeah" moment with Grandia.
Okay, so yeah, you are familiar with it a little bit.
Yeah, I do recall like the timing or the action bar, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. I hope that the phrases I used for those meters made some sense, but I understand that there's probably better terminology to use that I didn't write down.
No, I think you did a fine job. I do appreciate that in Child of Light that what was it, Ignis? Is that the character's name, the secondary character?
Yeah, Ignis is the little firefly that you can use. Essentially, he like overlays the battle screen and you can direct him towards enemies or allies. And also the movement of Ignis across the screen means that his actions can't be instantaneous either. Like you do have to move him between an ally or an enemy and from enemy to enemy. And when there's multiple enemies on a timeline or allies that need something, you can end up like swirling him around the screen, like trying to just juggle these micro actions in the middle of otherwise selecting things on menus, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, it adds a whole different element or control to an otherwise menu-driven battle system. It's interesting because these games take on like essentially they don't feel that different in terms of like outside of gameplay. And in contrast, a series that is hailed as many to be like essentially one of the last best like JRPGs would be Persona. And I find Persona in a lot of ways doesn't really change the formula of the battle system, but instead changes everything around it to modernize it and make it more approachable for people that did not grow up playing Final Fantasy on the Nintendo or Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, as it used to be called. And I don't know, like looking at the time I've spent with Octopath Traveler, which utilizes this Bravely Default system more or less. Oh wait, are you still with me, Scott?
Yeah, I am. I just watched you fast forward, like
ditto
a minute
here
of dialogue. Okay, yeah.
So looking at
good.
Octopath Traveler, where we have our Bravely Default system in play, where you can essentially conserve up boost points and so on, and the game relies a lot on boosts, debuffs, and so forth, and managing your BP in a way to maximize your damage output and minimize your intake, I guess you could say. It's hard for me to look at Persona in the same light and say, like, you know what? The battle system's great, because the battle system isn't necessarily all that fun, but because the presentation, the vibe, like everything else does so much that I enjoy playing that game, even just from a mechanical standpoint.
There's so much like style that is injected into you just selecting an action. In comparison to other games. Yeah, I think that's totally fair. It's like the presentation almost overshadows what you would consider a mechanical lacking otherwise. And there are elements that I think are really wonderful for Persona, with their knockdown system being sort of relevant to the system that we encounter in Octopath Traveler, and I think Bravely Default may or may not have had it, where you essentially break an enemy to a point of maybe taking an action out of their turn or opening them up for vulnerable attacks that they are more vulnerable towards. I like that mechanic a lot. It's another example of utilizing control in a battle that you can otherwise overcome by grinding or just really high damage output, but a more skilled player can play with a weaker set of units and manage a battle and be successful because of their mastery of those elements.
Yeah, that is true. That knockdown system is one that we I don't think I know it probably came up in another game beforehand in a different way, but that was something that made the game just inherently different.
Yeah, it was
from
very
others.
fresh when I played Persona. It was very fresh when I played Persona 3 to me because I hadn't experienced something like that before. There's one thing to target an enemy's weakness, but it's another thing for that weakness to allow you to do more than just extra damage on that action.
And there were enemies in Persona as well as Octopath Traveler where it's their weaknesses actually don't damage them that much, but it's a way to knock them down. And either do your all-out attack or use the free turn to essentially heal up.
The only thing I think that was worth noting about the difference between Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler for those mechanics is I also noticed that in Bravely Default, you're essentially defaulting or passing a turn to utilize it later in Bravely Default. So you default to save up more BP and then Brave to use the actions later. I really like that Octopath Traveler made getting those boosts automatic because then it's more... I like games that there is essentially some sort of passive reward system for management as opposed to a much more investment and return system in which waiting turns is boring and it's sort of a waste of time in the game. You can still expose vulnerability while getting advantages added to your characters. There are ways to balance that without making a player skip a turn. Because no one wants to watch their units get beat up on for another 1 or 2 turns by enemies when you can just make enemies do more damage or expose weaknesses in less turns. So I really enjoyed that improvement.
They balance it in a way that doesn't feel broken either. Because once you use the boosts, your boost points in a turn, the next turn you don't actually get another one. Yeah. They definitely do a good job. And you're absolutely right. It's not fun to wait. So the fact you can do something, quite frankly, I find myself at times not doing my buffs just because it's boring to buff. And that's not smart. And when I face enemies that I need to buff, I will, but it's it's taxing otherwise. If I know I'm going to beat the boss or beat the enemy fine without buffing, I'm going to do it because buffing is boring. I'd much rather have it be something like in Darkest Dungeon where I have a lunge attack that then gets me to the front of the row or something and gives me a buff or something on top of it.
Pairing an action with a benefit is very nice. It's one of the reasons I actually really enjoy the merchants hired help where you can hire people and then get a buff out of it with a damaging action. That feels really clean and a resourceful use of my, I guess, SP and turn. Versus just doing the peacock strut.
Darkest Dungeon's a great example of a fresh approach on turn-based RPGs,
Absolutely.
Especially when it takes away so much control from the player in some respects. Or rather, it doesn't take away control, but instead, we're so used to having a variety of skills or abilities straight from the onset. And in Darkest Dungeon, you're limited to only having 4, and sometimes less depending on where your character is. It forces you to rethink the entire battle or format of not only your team but the way you play the game.
You also relinquish control of your party in the sense that they have these mental vulnerabilities. You have to manage these players. You're treating them in a much more organic or human way in how you interact with them. In games like Octopath Traveler, I will make, if Alphen has an attack, which he does, that does more damage when he's close to death, I'll make Alphen soak damage, until he's at like 10 health. In Darkest Dungeon, getting that close to lethal health, like that stresses everybody out, and that's a negative outcome. But in this game, I can just be like, Alphen, you got to soak it, buddy. I need that axe attack in 2 more turns. So it definitely adds a new layer of party management that is, I think, just much more immersive in that sense. Like, these aren't just pawns that you're using they are pawns. You treat them like pawns in Darkest Dungeon oftentimes, but I do feel more attachment and like investment into characters and their well-being in that game, because their well-being really matters to my success and their individual growth as units, which later impact my success. Like, it always comes back to consequence on the player, but maybe it's not immediately apparent. And so it gets to hide behind that veil of just being a more immersive component.
The way it also weaves its story, if you want to call it a story within Darkest Dungeon, how it's like the dungeon crawling is not anything special or unique in terms of innovation. It's unique because it's not often... It kind of looks like a D&D dungeon board.
It's very similar.
Yeah, that part's unique in that you probably wouldn't have envisioned that type of game to bring it up, but then they essentially use the battle system screen as your dungeon crawling screen, which works. I don't necessarily give it credit otherwise than being a minimalistic approach, I guess. I'm going to go back to Octopath Traveler for a second, because it kind of occurred to me as I was getting through the second chapters and realizing that all of these areas were technically open. They were just kind of being held back by a difficulty curve or a difficulty of monsters and so forth. But Octopath Traveler is kind of also like an open world turn-based RPG. Like, open world is maybe not the best term for it, but it's like the closest I can think of in a turn-based RPG, because Final Fantasy 15 is arguably open world-ish, but it's then also like an action adventure RPG as well. And I think that's another reason why I find Octopath Traveler so refreshing, because I technically don't have any set like orders telling me to go someplace, or I don't have one bridge to cross and one kingdom to locate and visit.
There's no main storyline icon or like beacon that is just drawing your attention somewhere, saying, hey, you don't have to go here, but this is where you want to go. Like, ultimately, you have to go here next. Octopath Traveler tackles that by saying, here's 8 different directions you can pick. One of them will progress you further in that direction. If you ignore the other 7, they'll be there for you to tackle later. Like, whatever you want to do.
It really is Skyrim in some ways that, like, I would otherwise feel uncomfortable suggesting, because I don't like Skyrim or Oblivion that much after having time to play and like dissect it more.
I think the open world elements of those games, they can be disappointing at sometimes, but I think that Octopath Traveler really indicates the strength sometimes of having an open world. If it's built in a way where there are a lot of different things that are accessible to the player early on, and you continue to just have this essentially like radial access to whatever interests you, in the same way that not Skyward Sword, I'm sorry, Breath of the Wild in Legend of Zelda had the ability for your character to pretty much go to most any place at any level, really impacted like players' individual experiences and enjoyment of the game overall. Because ultimately you want to explore everywhere, but getting to choose what's most exciting to you first is such a satisfying feeling for a player. Dude,
I didn't even visit the island village in Breath of the Wild. And
oh yeah, the coastal village with all the fishermen and whatnot.
Yeah, didn't even see it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, like,
that's actually really neat that you missed it completely.
If you were to think of it from a way of like, well, that just means that X number of players that I would represent don't interact at all with this piece of content that we designed. So isn't that technically like inefficient game creation or game development? Yeah, I guess. But like, you know, in the same way that like not everyone is going to choose the badass shepherd side in Mass Effect. So for the people that only do Paragon, all of our efforts put into Renegade Shepherd, which by the way, everyone should play Renegade Shepherd at some point in time, goes unused or unviewed. So it makes it like less efficient. But I appreciate the freedoms at which you can in which you can take content or digest it or ignore it. And in doing so, you don't feel penalized by it either. Whereas,
yeah, I've
like
never
Skyrim,
visited Florida, but it's okay that I've never been there. And I think that's sort of in that. Is it Lurelin Village? Like, that's the same kind of idea for you. You didn't visit Lurelin Village. You may have missed out on a little bit, but was Breath of the Wild a great game for you? It was. And it's not because you skipped it or you saw Lurelin Village that was the case.
It's another reason to go back to it. Like, I still got a full experience from the game. And I don't know. Maybe that's just to say that there is so much to do in Breath of the Wild that is already satisfying. Whereas I feel like the issue in Skyrim is that there is not enough to do.
It doesn't feel saturated. Yeah.
And like I feel that same way with Octopath Traveler, where it occurred to me something interesting was going on when I did a quest. Tiff's been watching me do most of the story of Octopath. I'll grind on my own and stuff. I did a quest regarding two separate quests. One was leading. I'm sure you have probably done something to this extent too, but I'm going to keep details on the low just in case. One involves freeing a man from a prison cell because he claims he's innocent. And apparently you can just go and get the prison cell key from a drunk guard. Or you can actually get eyewitness testimony from people around the town. And so I got both. I got to the prisoner and I was given two options, or three. I could leave, or I could provide him with the testimony or give him the key to his cell. And I gave him the testimony because I'm not a dick.
It makes him an innocent man, yeah.
Exactly. So he gets out that way. But there's multiple solutions to at least a handful of these quests. Another one where it's a group of low-class people, we'll say, that are plotting a rebellion. And you can technically,
take their
Tiffany
weapons. Yeah.
just went around and stole all of their weapons, stopping the rebellion in that case. But the other option is actually hearing about some lord's plans to essentially educate and try and integrate the slums into like the town proper. And like, what's the difference between the two? One apparently doesn't give you a cutscene, as Tiff tells me, of the two leaders of the two sides of town essentially, reconciling. And I don't know, it's that sort of freedom that screams out like the equivalent of like open world quest telling, be it Fallout.
It reminds me of old
Dragon
school
Age.
Fallout. Yeah.
Exactly. And the game doesn't necessarily force feed you down the idea of you have two options. Instead, it just lets you discover them on their own. And I think that's like, it's just yet another small thing that like I have not seen in traditional JRPG or turn-based RPGs. And I think Fallout falls under that, even though it's like grid-based as well, or movement, like tactical-based.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's usually you're given the choices up front in a way, or the game like really lets you know about them, and there might be like a hidden third or fourth choice. But to let the game trust that you're smart enough to explore the possibilities goes a long ways for me, and that. Like I just said, yet another way that Octopath Traveler is like refreshing to me, despite being such an aged, classical looking game with some modern enhancements in 3D. It is just able to make me rethink what's possible for a pixel drawn or pixel based turn-based RPG. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that kind of tackles it on that end. You ready to wrap?
Yeah. Oh, actually, there is one issue I have with Octopath Traveler, and that is the tearing effect that happens by the way they view the pixel characters as you zoom in and out or pan to the sides.
Yeah.
There had to have been like a better way to do that.
I happened to notice that when I was on the Gold Coast or whatever, and I was wondering if it was supposed to be, if it was an intended effect to add like, because I was on the coast and I'm like, is this like haze of sunlight or something? Like, is this rays of sun that I'm seeing, or is it just really bad pixel tearing that I just noticed now?
Well, you also notice it in battle when you're like rotating around the characters. You'll notice that their pixels.
It's like at a slant while they move the perspective or the angle.
And you'll see the pixel morphing too, where like certain pixels in the character's face appear bigger or become bigger actually than other pixels because of the angle that it's located at. At this point, I really feel like I have to nitpick to say things that are bad about Octopath Traveler. But that does bother me. Like every time I go into battle, I see that deforming pixel line or row of pixels, and I just can't get over it.
If you have comments, questions, or concerns about Fancy Ramen's pixel tearing, you can go ahead and send us an email at podcast@fancyramen.com.
I was worried you might have forgotten it for a second there. You could also talk about how our video chat is getting fucked up because of my bad bandwidth or bad internet service.
I was talking to some friends yesterday on Discord while we were playing League, and we were shit talking someone's internet connection, and it ultimately got reverted that the guy who lives in a secluded mountain town is shit talking someone about their internet connection. And I kind of had to concede that point. So, I always wonder how much of it is you and how much of it is me.
Could be a little mixture of both. My internet's been doing better lately, but that does not make me feel any differently about upgrading so I can stream and stuff.
I don't really have issues on my end, but when it comes to like big things like this, it seems to pop up. So I'm really uncertain of how much is a contribution from my end.
And leave a like, suggestion, whatever below if you're on YouTube, or leave a review if you're using one of many podcast subscription services like Stitcher, Bean Farm, or
Wherever else
Podcasts Are
you found
Us.
It, yeah. And if you want to do a verbal review to one of your friends, go ahead and tell them about us. And at the end of your elevator pitch, you can just yell 5 stars in their face. So, thanks for listening, guys.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.